The sound of wrapping paper tearing filled the living room as my family gathered around our artificial Christmas tree. I'd driven 45 minutes from Columbus to Cedar Falls that morning, carrying homemade cookies and carefully wrapped gifts, expecting the usual chaotic but warm holiday celebration. My parents, Bob and Linda Mitchell, sat on their worn leather couch, coffee mugs in hand, watching as my younger brother David unwrapped what looked like a small jewelry box. Inside, nestled against red velvet, was a single house key attached to a keychain that read, "Home Sweet Home." "Congratulations, son," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "The house is officially yours now." I felt my stomach drop. The house? Our family home on Maple Street. The ranch-style house with the big oak tree in the front yard where we'd carved our initials as kids? David looked up, grinning like he'd just won the lottery, while I sat frozen on the floor surrounded by discarded ribbon and torn gift wrap. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. My mother Linda set down her mug and looked at me with what I can only describe as practiced patience. "Well, honey, David's been helping us so much with the house repairs and the yard work, it just makes sense. Besides, you have your own place in Columbus." Before I could process what was happening, my father cleared his throat. "Of course, Sarah, you're always welcome here. You can sleep in the garage when you visit." We converted it into a nice little studio space. The garage. They were offering me the garage in the house I grew up in, the house where I'd spent 18 years of my life, where I'd studied for college entrance exams at the kitchen table, where I'd nursed my mother through her bout with pneumonia just 2 winters ago. Meanwhile, David, who had been living in the basement for the past 3 years, was being handed the deed like it was just another Christmas present. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at that key in David's hand, watching the morning light from the window catch its brass surface, and felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the hollow feeling you get when you realize you've been reading the situation completely wrong. I thought I was daughter coming home for Christmas. Turns out, I was just a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Growing up in Cedar Falls, everyone knew the Mitchell family. We were the ones who never missed a Sunday service at St. Mark's Methodist Church, the family that organized the annual neighborhood block party, the ones who shoveled Mrs. Peterson's driveway every winter without being asked. My parents had worked hard to build their reputation in our small Ohio town, and I'd always assumed I was part of that legacy. Bob Mitchell had been an insurance claims adjuster for 23 years, the kind of man who wore the same style of khakis and polo shirts every weekend and could fix almost anything that broke in the house. Linda worked part-time as a bookkeeper for Dr. Thompson's dental practice, but her real passion was organizing community events and maintaining what she called proper family values. They'd bought the house on Maple Street when I was 8 years old, stretching their budget to afford the 3-bedroom ranch with the attached garage and the big backyard where we'd installed a swing set. David had always been different from me. Where I was methodical and driven, he was spontaneous and charming. In high school, I'd been the one helping him with his homework, covering for him when he came home past curfew, making excuses to our parents when he forgot to do his chores. He had this way of making people want to take care of him, this effortless charm that made teachers give him extra credit and made our parents overlook his shortcomings. After graduation, I'd thrown myself into college, working part-time jobs to help pay for expenses, even though I had scholarships. I studied marketing and communications, graduated with honors, and landed a position at a respected firm in Columbus. David, meanwhile, had tried community college for a semester, then bounced between jobs delivering pizza, working at the hardware store, and helping a friend's landscaping business during the summers. Our parents always called it finding his path, as if his inability to stick with anything was somehow noble. The pattern had been there all along, I realized, sitting in that living room with torn wrapping paper at my feet. When David crashed his car senior year of high school, I'd been the one who drove him to work for 2 months, while our parents helped him buy a replacement. When he'd had his appendix out 3 years ago, I'd taken vacation days to help care for him because our parents couldn't miss work. When he'd broken up with his longtime girlfriend, Amanda, and gone into what he called a dark period, I'd driven to Cedar Falls every weekend for 2 months, bringing groceries and making sure he ate actual meals instead of surviving on energy drinks and cereal. But somehow, in the arithmetic of family contributions, none of that seemed to count. What counted was that David mowed the lawn every Saturday, that he'd helped Dad install new gutters last spring, that he was there every evening to eat dinner with them and watch their favorite television shows. Physical presence apparently trumped everything else. "The garage is really nice now," my mother continued, clearly trying to fill the silence that had settled over the room. "We insulated it last year, and there's that little space heater. David helped us put up some drywall, and we moved in the old couch from the basement. It's quite cozy." Cozy! The garage where we used to store Christmas decorations and where Dad kept his workbench was now being presented as suitable accommodations for their eldest daughter. I looked around the living room, at the family photos on the mantle, at the Christmas stockings hanging from the fireplace. Mine was still there, Sarah, embroidered in red thread, but it felt like a prop now, something maintained for appearances rather than genuine inclusion. David finally spoke up, his voice carrying that tone he'd perfected over the years, the one that made his selfishness sound reasonable. "I mean, it's not like I asked for this. Mom and Dad thought it would be good for me to have more responsibility. And you're never here anyway, Sarah. You've got your whole life in Columbus." There it was, the casual dismissal wrapped in logic. I wasn't here, therefore I didn't matter. The fact that I visited every other weekend, that I called twice a week, that I'd spent countless hours helping with family crises from 45 minutes away, apparently meant nothing compared to David's daily proximity. I thought about all the conversations I'd had with my parents about their retirement plans, about the house becoming too much for them to maintain as they got older. I'd assumed, perhaps naively, that when that time came, we'd figure it out together. Maybe sell the house and help them find something smaller, or maybe work out some arrangement where we could all contribute to its upkeep. I'd never imagined that the solution would be to simply give it to David while relegating me to visitor status. The most painful part wasn't even the house itself. It was the realization that this decision had been made without me, that my parents had sat down with David and planned this whole thing while I was completely unaware. How many conversations had they had about it? How long had they been working on converting the garage into what they clearly saw as my future accommodation? The insulation Mom mentioned, the drywall David had helped install, the space heater they'd bought. All of it had been preparation for this moment, this Christmas morning, when they'd present their solution to what they apparently saw as, quote, the Sarah problem. I looked at my brother holding that key, and I saw something in his expression that I'd been missing for years. It wasn't just gratitude or excitement. It was satisfaction. He'd won something, and he knew it. This wasn't just about the house or practicality or any of the reasonable explanations my parents were offering. This was about establishing, once and for all, who mattered more in the Mitchell family hierarchy. "Well," I said, standing up and brushing wrapping paper off my jeans, "I guess congratulations are in order." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "This is quite a surprise." My father nodded, seeming relieved that I was taking it so well. "We thought about telling you beforehand, but we wanted it to be a Christmas surprise. We know you'll understand, honey. You've always been the practical one. The practical one. The one who could be counted on to understand, to go along with whatever the family decided, to make her own arrangements without complaining. I'd been practical when I'd chosen a college major that would lead to stable employment. I'd been practical when I'd moved to Columbus for better job opportunities. I'd been practical when I'd helped David through his various crises without asking for anything in return. And now I was expected to be practical about being demoted to garage guest in my own family home. I walked over to the window and looked out at the front yard, at the oak tree where Dad had hung a tire swing when we were kids. David had been the one who'd wanted to swing higher, who'd dared me to jump off at the highest point. I'd been the one who'd insisted we wear helmets, who'd made sure the rope was secure, who'd convinced him to start with smaller swings before working up to the dangerous ones. Even then, I'd been the one making sure he was safe while he got to have all the fun. "I should probably head back to Columbus," I said, turning away from the window. "I have some work to catch up on before Monday." It was a lie, but it was easier than staying and pretending this was normal. I needed time to process what had just happened, to figure out how I felt about being relegated to garage status in my own family. "But you just got here." my mother protested. We haven't even had Christmas dinner yet. I made your favorite green bean casserole. My favorite green bean casserole. As if vegetables could somehow compensate for being written out of the family property deed. I managed to smile and gave her a hug, then walked over to David and shook his hand. Take good care of the place, I said, and I meant it. Whatever else was happening, I didn't want to see the house fall into disrepair. He looked momentarily uncertain, as if he'd expected more of a fight. Sarah, you know this doesn't change anything between us, right? You're still my sister, still his sister, but apparently not still their daughter. At least, not in any way that came with equal consideration or respect. I nodded and gathered my coat and purse, leaving the cookies I'd brought on the kitchen counter and the gifts I'd wrapped for my parents under the tree. As I drove back toward Columbus, I kept thinking about that key in David's hand. It wasn't just a house key anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd never quite understood about my place in the Mitchell family. I'd spent years trying to be the daughter they could be proud of, the one who made good choices and helped when needed and never caused problems. But somehow, in trying to be so good, I'd made myself invisible. I'd become the one they could count on to understand, to go along with whatever they decided, to never make demands or cause complications. The garage offer wasn't really about accommodation. It was about putting me in my place, literally and figuratively. I could visit the family home, but I couldn't really belong there anymore. I could be David's sister, but I couldn't be an equal heir to the family legacy. I could be practical, understanding Sarah, who would make the best of whatever arrangement they decided was appropriate. But as I pulled into my apartment complex in Columbus, I realized something had changed in me during that 45-minute drive. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in being practical. I wasn't interested in understanding their reasoning or making the best of an unfair situation. I was interested in finding out exactly how this decision had been made, and whether there was more to the story than what I'd been told on Christmas morning. That night, I sat in my small but comfortable apartment, looking at the Christmas tree I'd decorated for myself, and made a decision. I wasn't going to accept the garage. I wasn't going to pretend this was reasonable or fair. And I was going to find out exactly what had been going on in my family while I'd been busy being the practical daughter who could be counted on to go along with whatever they decided. The house key might have been given to David, but I still had questions that needed answers. And for the first time in my life, I was going to insist on getting them, regardless of whether my parents found my curiosity convenient or practical. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and I was going to find out what it was. Monday morning came with the kind of gray January sky that makes you question whether spring will ever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Return to Ohio. I sat at my desk at Henderson Marketing, staring at a spreadsheet full of quarterly projections, but my mind kept drifting back to that house key glinting in David's palm. 3 days had passed since Christmas, and I still felt like I was walking around with something lodged in my chest. A splinter of confusion and hurt that wouldn't dislodge no matter how much I tried to rationalize what had happened. My coworker Jennifer knocked on my cubicle wall, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You look like someone who needs caffeine and possibly therapy," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Jennifer had been my closest friend at the office for the past 2 years. The kind of person who could read your mood from 3 cubicles away, and always seemed to know when you needed someone to listen. I accepted the coffee gratefully, and found myself telling her everything. The Christmas morning surprise, the house key, the garage offer, the casual way my parents had announced that David was now the owner of the family home. Jennifer listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. "Wait, back up," she said when I finished. "They gave him the entire house? Just like that? What about you?" "Apparently I get garage privileges when I visit," I said, trying to keep my voice light, but even I could hear the bitterness creeping in. Jennifer set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Sarah, that's insane. That house has to be worth, what, $200,000? Maybe more in this market? And they just handed it over to your brother who's been living in their basement for 3 years? I'd been trying not to think about the financial implications, but Jennifer was right. The house on Maple Street had appreciated significantly since my parents bought it 15 years ago. Cedar Falls was close enough to Columbus that it had become an attractive option for people who wanted small-town living with access to city jobs. Similar houses in the neighborhood had been selling for well over $200,000. It's not about the money, I said, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. It was about the money, but it was also about what the money represented. It was about being valued, about being considered an equal member of the family, about having a stake in the place where I'd grown up. Maybe not for you, but it sure seems to be about the money for them, Jennifer pointed out. Think about it. They're basically giving your brother a $250,000 gift while offering you a space heater in the garage. That's not normal family behavior, Sarah. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but Jennifer's words kept echoing in my mind. It wasn't normal family behavior. I'd been so caught up in trying to understand the emotional dynamics that I hadn't really considered the practical implications. My parents were in their early 60s, still working, still healthy. Why were they giving away their house now? And why to David specifically? That evening, I called my friend Jessica Rodriguez, who'd been my roommate in college and remained one of my closest confidants. Jessica had always been more direct than me, the kind of person who would call out unfairness when she saw it. I valued her perspective because she didn't have any emotional investment in maintaining family harmony. This is messed up on so many levels, Jessica said after I explained the situation. First of all, who gives away a house as a Christmas present? That's not a stocking stuffer, Sarah. That's a major financial decision that should involve lawyers and proper documentation. Second, why now? Are your parents sick? Are they in financial trouble? This doesn't make sense. Jessica's questions were ones I hadn't thought to ask. In the shock of the moment, I'd focused on my feelings rather than the logistics. But she was right to be suspicious. My parents had always been careful with money, the type of people who compared prices at 3 different grocery stores and drove their cars until they literally couldn't be repaired anymore. The idea of them casually giving away their biggest asset didn't align with everything I knew about their financial philosophy. You need to find out what's really going on, Jessica continued. This isn't just about fairness anymore. Something else is happening here, and your parents aren't telling you the whole story. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment trying to piece together the timeline. When had my parents decided to give David the house? How long had they been planning this? I thought back to recent conversations, looking for clues I might have missed. Over the past year, there had been several mentions of David helping with house repairs. New gutters in the spring, some electrical work in the summer, painting the exterior in the fall. At the time, I'd been proud of him for taking initiative and helping our aging parents maintain their property. I'd even sent him a text thanking him for stepping up when I heard about the electrical work. But now I wondered if there had been more to it than simple filial responsibility. Had my parents been keeping track of his contributions? Had they been calculating some kind of debt that needed to be repaid? Or had David been more strategic about his helpfulness than I'd realized? I decided to drive to Cedar Falls that weekend, not to confront anyone but to observe. I wanted to see this garage conversion my mother had mentioned, to understand exactly what my parents thought was an appropriate living situation for their daughter. More importantly, I wanted to talk to some of the neighbors, people who might have a different perspective on what had been happening at the Mitchell house over the past year. Saturday morning found me parked across the street from my childhood home, feeling slightly ridiculous for conducting surveillance on my own family. The house looked the same as always, the white ranch with black shutters and the big oak tree in front. David's truck was in the driveway, and I could see him through the kitchen window, apparently having breakfast with our parents. I walked around to the back of the house and peered through the garage windows. My mother hadn't been exaggerating about the conversion. The space had been transformed from a typical garage into something resembling a studio apartment. There was new drywall, carpet, a small refrigerator, and what looked like a fold-out couch. A space heater sat in the corner, and someone had hung curtains over the windows. It was clean and functional, but it was still a garage. What struck me most was how permanent it looked. This wasn't a quick conversion done recently for my benefit. The work was too thorough, too finished. Someone had spent considerable time and money turning this space into living quarters. When had this happened, and why hadn't anyone mentioned it to me before Christmas morning? I decided to visit Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down. Eleanor Peterson had been on Maple Street for 30 years and had always been the unofficial neighborhood watchdog. She knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing information, especially if she thought something unusual was happening. Mrs. Peterson invited me in for coffee and immediately launched into updates about various neighbors. After 20 minutes of hearing about the Johnsons' new roof and the Garcias' ongoing divorce, I managed to steer the conversation toward my family. "Oh, your parents have been so busy with that garage project," she said, settling back into her armchair. "Started back in the spring, I think. David was over there every weekend, hauling materials and making quite a racket with all that construction. Your father seemed to be supervising, but David was doing most of the work." Spring. The garage conversion had been going on since spring, nearly 9 months before Christmas. This wasn't a recent decision made to accommodate family dynamics. This had been planned for the better part of a year. "Did they mention what they were planning to use the space for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, I assumed it was for David at first. He's been living in that basement for so long, and a young man needs his own space, you know. But then your mother mentioned something about it being for when you visit. She seemed quite pleased about it, said it would give you more privacy than staying in the house." More privacy. That was one way to frame being relegated to the garage. I wondered what else my mother had told the neighbors about this arrangement, how she'd spun the story to make it sound reasonable and considerate rather than insulting. "The whole house business was quite a surprise, though," Mrs. Peterson continued. "I saw David moving more of his things over from the basement to the main house right after Christmas. Your mother told me he was going to be taking over as the primary resident. Said it made sense since he was always there helping anyway. Primary resident. As if David had somehow earned squatters' rights through lawn maintenance and home repair." I thanked Mrs. Peterson for the coffee and walked slowly back to my car, processing everything I'd learned. The garage conversion had been in progress for 9 months. My parents had been telling neighbors that I would be staying there when I visited, as if this arrangement had always been the plan. David was now moving into the main house as the primary resident, a transition that had apparently begun immediately after Christmas. None of this felt spontaneous or recent. This felt orchestrated. I drove back to Columbus with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that Christmas morning had been the culmination of a plan, not the beginning of one. My parents hadn't suddenly decided to give David the house. They'd been working toward this outcome for months, possibly longer. That evening, I called my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister who lived about an hour away in Dayton. Carol had always been more straightforward than my mother, less concerned with maintaining perfect family appearances. If anyone would give me an honest perspective on what was happening, it would be her. "I was wondering when you'd call," Carol said after I explained why I was reaching out. "Linda mentioned the house situation over Thanksgiving, and I have to say, I was surprised by the timing." "What do you mean by timing?" There was a pause, and I could almost see Carol choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, honey, I probably shouldn't be the one telling you this, but your parents refinanced the house last year, took out a pretty substantial home equity loan. I don't know all the details, but Linda mentioned they needed some cash flow for David's situation." David's situation. I felt that familiar splinter in my chest expand into something sharper. "What situation?" "Well, he had some legal troubles last winter. Nothing serious, but there were lawyer fees and court costs. And then there was the business he wanted to start with that friend of his. I think your parents helped him out financially, maybe more than once." Legal troubles, a business venture, home equity loans. None of this had been mentioned to me, not even in passing. I'd been calling my parents twice a week for the past year, and somehow an entire financial crisis involving my brother had escaped my notice. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "I don't know the exact numbers, but Linda seemed stressed about it. She mentioned something about the monthly payments being higher than they'd expected. That's why I was surprised when she said they were giving David the house. It seemed like they'd be better off selling it and paying off the loan." After I hung up with Carol, I sat in my living room staring at the wall, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. David had gotten into legal trouble, which had cost my parents money. He'd wanted to start a business, which had cost them more money. They'd taken out a home equity loan to cover these expenses, leaving them with monthly payments they were struggling to meet. And now they'd given him the house, presumably so he could take over those payments. But that didn't explain why this had been presented as a Christmas gift rather than a financial necessity. It didn't explain why I'd been kept completely in the dark about David's problems or my parents' financial strain. And it certainly didn't explain why I was being offered garage accommodations instead of being included in discussions about how to handle the family's financial situation. I spent the rest of the weekend researching property records online, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Public records showed that my parents had indeed taken out a significant home equity loan 8 months earlier. The amount was substantial enough that the monthly payments would represent a significant portion of their combined income. I also found records of a business registration for something called D&A Landscaping Services, with David Mitchell listed as the primary owner. The business had been registered 6 months ago but appeared to have been dissolved just 2 months later. Whatever venture David had started with my parents' money, it hadn't lasted long. By Sunday evening, I had assembled a clearer picture of what had been happening in my family while I'd been busy living my own life in Columbus. David had gotten into legal trouble, possibly involving his previous girlfriend Amanda, though the details weren't clear. My parents had helped him with lawyer fees and court costs. He'd then convinced them to invest in a landscaping business that had failed within months. To cover these expenses, my parents had mortgaged their house, leaving them with payments they couldn't comfortably afford. The solution, apparently, had been to give David the house and make him responsible for the mortgage payments. From a practical standpoint, it made some sense. He was living there anyway, he needed a permanent residence, and transferring ownership would make him legally responsible for the debt he'd essentially created. But the way it had been handled, the secrecy and the Christmas morning surprise, suggested that my parents knew this arrangement wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. They'd presented it as a gift, as a reward for David's helpfulness, rather than as a bailout for his financial irresponsibility. They'd offered me the garage as if it were a generous accommodation rather than an insult. Most importantly, they'd made this major family financial decision without including me in any of the discussions, despite the fact that I was the financially stable member of the family, the one with good credit and steady income who might actually have been able to help them find a better solution. I realized that my parents hadn't just given David the house. They'd protected him from the consequences of his actions while simultaneously excluding me from decisions that affected the entire family's future. And they'd done it all while maintaining the fiction that this was a normal, generous Christmas gift. For the first time since Christmas morning, I wasn't just hurt or confused. I was angry. Not the sharp, immediate anger that flares up and burns out quickly, but the deep, slow-burning anger that comes from realizing you've been systematically deceived by people you trusted. My parents had spent months planning this outcome, months during which they'd talked to me twice a week without mentioning any of the circumstances that had led to their decision. They'd let me continue thinking I was part of a family that made decisions together, that shared important information, that treated all members with equal respect. Instead, I'd been an outsider all along, someone to be managed and placated rather than included and consulted. The garage offer wasn't an accommodation. It was a consolation prize, a way to make themselves feel better about cutting me out of family decisions while maintaining the appearance of inclusion. I could visit the family home, but only as a guest in a converted garage, dependent on their hospitality and goodwill. But I wasn't interested in being a guest in my own family anymore. I wasn't interested in accepting whatever arrangements they decided were appropriate for me. And I definitely wasn't interested in pretending that their deception was somehow reasonable or justified. I had questions that needed answers, and I was going to get them. Not by accepting their explanations or trying to understand their perspective, but by demanding the truth about what had been happening in my family while I'd been kept in the dark. The practical daughter who always understood, who always went along with family decisions, who never caused trouble, was about to become a lot more complicated. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was heating up leftover Chinese takeout. I'd been expecting it, honestly. 3 weeks had passed since my conversation with Aunt Carol, and I'd been waiting for the family damage control to begin. My mother's voice was artificially bright when I answered. the tone she used when she was trying to smooth over unpleasantness. "Hi, sweetheart, I was just thinking about you. We haven't talked much since Christmas, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Everything was not okay, but I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I'd spent the past 3 weeks quietly gathering information, making phone calls to old family friends, and piecing together a timeline of events that painted a very different picture than the one presented on Christmas morning. "I'm fine, Mom, just busy with work." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been busy, but not necessarily with the kind of work she assumed. "Well, I hope you're not upset about the house situation. I know it was a surprise, but we really thought you'd be happy for David. He's been working so hard to get his life together." There it was, the narrative my parents had constructed. David working hard, getting his life together, deserving of reward and recognition. No mention of legal troubles or failed businesses or home equity loans taken out to cover his mistakes. "Mom, can I ask you something? When exactly did you and Dad decide to give David the house?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm that this wasn't a casual family decision made on Christmas Eve. "Well, we'd been thinking about it for a while. David has been such a help with the maintenance, and he's really matured over the past year." Matured. That was an interesting way to describe someone who'd required parental bailouts for legal fees and business failures. But I didn't push the issue, not yet. I was still gathering information, and confronting my mother prematurely would only put her on the defensive. "I see. And the garage conversion, when did you start planning that?" Another pause. "Oh, that was David's idea, actually. He thought it would be nice for you to have your own space when you visit, instead of staying in your old bedroom. More privacy, you know." David's idea. Of course it was. I wondered what other helpful suggestions my brother had made during the months when my parents were struggling to cover his expenses. Had he also suggested that they not mention any of this to me? Had he been the one to frame my exclusion as a thoughtful gesture toward my independence? After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at my untouched dinner and feeling the weight of accumulated lies. My mother wasn't just protecting David's version of events. She was actively participating in rewriting history. The struggling parents who'd taken out a loan to cover their son's legal problems had become generous parents, rewarding their son's helpfulness. The daughter who'd been systematically excluded from family decisions had become the daughter who'd been thoughtfully provided with private accommodations. I decided it was time to talk to Amanda Thompson, David's ex-girlfriend. Amanda had worked at the bank in Cedar Falls, and she'd been part of our extended family circle for nearly 3 years before their breakup. If David's legal troubles had involved her, she might be willing to share information that no one else would provide. Amanda agreed to meet me for coffee at a place in Columbus, neutral territory where she wouldn't have to worry about running into David or my parents. She looked tired when she arrived, older than I remembered, with the kind of weariness that comes from having navigated difficult circumstances. "I wondered if someone from David's family would eventually reach out," she said after we'd ordered our drinks. "I heard about the house thing through mutual friends. It must have been quite a shock." "You could say that." "Amanda, I'm trying to understand what's been going on in my family, and I get the feeling there are things I don't know about." "My parents mentioned David had some legal issues last year?" Amanda's expression tightened. "Legal issues. That's one way to put it." She was quiet for a moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. "David used my name and personal information to open several credit accounts without my permission. When I found out and reported it, he claimed it was a misunderstanding, that we'd discussed it and I'd agreed to help him with his business idea." Identity theft. My brother had committed identity theft against his own girlfriend, then tried to claim it was a miscommunication. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How much money was involved? About $15,000 across 3 different credit cards, plus a business line of credit that he defaulted on almost immediately. Amanda stirred her coffee absently. "Your parents hired a lawyer to negotiate a settlement. They paid back most of the money to avoid criminal charges, and David got community service and probation. $15,000, plus lawyer fees, plus court costs. No wonder my parents had needed to take out a home equity loan." But this information raised even more questions than it answered. "Amanda, did my parents know what David had done? I mean, did they know it was identity theft?" She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Sarah, your father came to the police station when David was arrested. He was there for every court hearing. They absolutely knew what he'd done." My father had been present for David's arrest and court proceedings, which meant my parents had been dealing with this crisis for months while I remained completely unaware. They'd hired lawyers, negotiated settlements, attended hearings, and somehow managed to keep all of it secret from me, despite our regular phone conversations. "Why didn't they tell me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I think they were embarrassed. And I think they were protecting David. Your mother called me once after everything was settled, asking me not to mention it to other people in town. She said David was trying to rebuild his reputation, and she didn't want gossip to make things harder for him." Protecting David's reputation. Of course. My parents had prioritized protecting their son's image over keeping their daughter informed about major family crises. They'd asked his victim to stay quiet to preserve his standing in the community, while I'd continued calling twice a week, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around my brother's criminal behavior. "There's something else you should probably know," Amanda continued. "The business David started after all this, the landscaping thing, he used some of your parents' money to buy equipment, but he never actually registered the business properly or got the necessary licenses. When potential customers started asking for proof of insurance and bonding, the whole thing fell apart. I heard he sold the equipment for maybe half of what your parents had invested. So David had not only cost my parents money through his legal troubles, he'd then convinced them to invest in a business venture that he'd botched through his own negligence. The failed landscaping company wasn't just bad luck or a tough market. It was another example of David's pattern of irresponsibility and poor decision-making." "Amanda, I have to ask this, and I hope you don't take it the wrong way. Why are you telling me all this? You don't owe me any information, especially after what David put you through." She smiled for the first time since we'd sat down, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Because I know what it's like to be kept in the dark about David's behavior. I know what it's like to find out that everyone around you knew things you didn't know, that they all decided together to protect you from information you had a right to have. I spent months feeling like I was going crazy, like I was missing something obvious that everyone else could see." Amanda's words hit me with unexpected force. She was describing exactly how I'd been feeling since Christmas morning, that sense of being out of step with everyone else's understanding of reality. The difference was that she'd been protected from David's financial irresponsibility until it directly affected her. I had been protected from it even when it was being solved with family resources that should have been mine to know about. After Amanda left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing everything she'd told me. David's legal troubles weren't just embarrassing family drama that my parents had chosen to handle privately. They were serious crimes that had required significant financial resources to resolve. The house transfer wasn't a generous Christmas gift. It was the final step in a year-long process of covering for David's mistakes while excluding me from knowledge or decision-making. My parents had known when they called me twice a week that they were dealing with identity theft charges and business failures and mounting legal bills. They'd known when they asked about my job and my apartment and my dating life that they were struggling with mortgage payments taken out to cover their son's crimes. They'd known when they wished me happy birthday and sent me cards for Easter and asked about my plans for summer vacation that they were planning to give away the family home without consulting me. But more than that, they'd actively participated in maintaining the deception. When I'd praised David for helping with house repairs, they'd accepted my admiration without mentioning that his help was part of working off a debt to them. When I'd sent him congratulatory texts about taking initiative, they'd let me continue believing in a version of events that they knew was false. The garage conversion hadn't been David's thoughtful idea for my comfort. It had been his solution to the problem of what to do with me once he took over the main house. He'd literally planned to relegate me to outbuilding status, while ensuring that I'd be grateful for the accommodation. I drove home in a state of mind I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just anger or hurt or disappointment. It was the complete reorganization of my understanding of my place in my family. I'd thought I was the responsible daughter whose parents were proud of her independence and success. Instead, I was the convenient daughter who could be counted on not to ask uncomfortable questions or demand inconvenient transparency. I'd thought David was the charming but irresponsible brother who was finally starting to mature and take on adult responsibilities. Instead, He was a manipulative person who'd committed identity theft against his girlfriend and then convinced our parents to bail him out while ensuring that I remained ignorant of his behavior. I'd thought my parents were honest people who made family decisions based on fairness and consideration for everyone involved. Instead, they were people who could maintain elaborate deceptions while looking me in the eye twice a week, who could prioritize protecting one child's reputation over respecting another child's right to know what was happening in her own family. That evening, I called Jessica and told her everything Amanda had shared. Jessica listened without interrupting, but I could hear her growing anger even through the phone. "Sarah, this is beyond messed up. Your brother committed a felony, and your parents not only covered for him financially, but also kept you completely in the dark while they were doing it. Then they gave him the family house as a reward for nearly bankrupting them. This isn't favoritism anymore. This is enabling criminal behavior while systematically lying to you about it." Jessica was right, but hearing it stated so clearly made me realize something else. My parents' behavior wasn't just about protecting David or avoiding embarrassment. It was about maintaining control over the family narrative. By keeping me ignorant of David's problems, they'd ensured that I couldn't offer alternative solutions or challenge their decisions. They'd made themselves the sole arbiters of what information I was allowed to have and what role I was allowed to play in family decisions. The house transfer wasn't just financial necessity disguised as generosity. It was the culmination of a pattern in which my parents decided what I needed to know, when I needed to know it, and how I was expected to respond. They'd trained me over years to be the understanding daughter who didn't ask too many questions, who accepted whatever explanations they offered, who could be counted on to go along with whatever they decided was best for the family. But I was done being that daughter. I was done accepting information on a need-to-know basis. Done pretending that being excluded from major family decisions was somehow for my own good. Done allowing my parents to manage my relationship with my brother by controlling what I knew about his behavior. I spent the rest of the week planning my next move. I wasn't interested in having another polite conversation with my mother about family dynamics or attempting to reason with my father about fairness. I wanted documentation. I wanted to understand the full scope of what had been happening, and I wanted to confront my family with facts rather than emotions. I started by researching the legal proceedings Amanda had mentioned. Court records were public information, and I was able to find documentation of David's arrest, the charges filed against him, and the plea agreement that had resolved the case. The details were worse than Amanda had indicated. David hadn't just used her personal information for credit cards. He'd forged her signature on loan documents and used her employment information to qualify for business credit he had no intention of repaying. I also found records of the civil settlement my parents had paid to resolve Amanda's claims against David. The amount was substantial, more than many people made in a year, and it had been paid in a lump sum just 2 months before my parents took out their home equity loan. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to visit Cedar Falls again. But this time, I wasn't going to observe from a distance or gather information from neighbors. I was going to knock on the front door of my childhood home and demand answers to questions that had been put off far too long. I was going to confront the people who'd spent months lying to me about the most significant events in our family's recent history. I was going to stop being the daughter who could be managed and start being the daughter who demanded the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.